Welcome, dear travelers, to Mystic Bedtime Stories, where history whispers its most enchanting secrets into the peaceful hours of night. I'm your guide through the corridors of time, where forgotten civilizations still dance in the shadows of awe. Memory and ancient voices call to us across the centuries. Tonight, we embark on a journey unlike any other. We're not traveling to grand palaces or towering cities of stone. Instead, we're drawn to a place where the horizon stretches endlessly in every direction, where the sky touches the earth in an embrace that has remained unchanged for thousands of years. We're heading to the great steppes of Eurasia to walk alongside the most mysterious and magnificent riders the world has ever known. Close your eyes now and let your breathing slow. Feel yourself settling into the comfort of this moment, this space between waking and dreaming. Allow your mind to drift backward through time, past the busy centuries of our modern world, past the age of exploration and the rise of nations, past the medieval kingdoms and the fall of Rome. We're traveling back over 2,000 years, to a time when the written word was rare and precious, when stories lived in the hearts of people and traveled on horseback across vast distances. The wind is beginning to stir now. Can you feel it? It carries with it the scent of wild grasses, the distant sound of horses moving across open ground, and something else, something deeper. It carries the whispers of a people who lived as one with the endless sky, who knew no walls or boundaries, who measured their wealth not in gold stored in vaults, but in the strength of their horses and the sharpness of their arrows. These are the Scythians and the Sarmatians, the nomadic lords of the steppes, peoples whose names have echoed through history like wind through tall grass. They were called barbarians by the settled peoples of Greece and Rome, but they were something far more magnificent than that simple word could ever capture. They were artists who worked in gold and leather, warriors who could loose an arrow with deadly accuracy while riding at full gallop, and dreamers who saw the divine in every sunrise over the boundless grasslands. Tonight, we'll ride with them across their endless domain. We'll sit by their fires under stars that seemed close enough to touch. We'll hear their stories, witness their ceremonies, and understand why the memory of these remarkable people continues to haunt the imagination of the world. Their cities were made of felt and wood, designed to move with the seasons. Their highways were invisible paths across the grass, known only to those who could read the subtle language of the land itself. But they left behind more than just stories. In burial mounds scattered across thousands of miles, archaeologists have uncovered treasures that speak of a sophisticated civilization that valued beauty, honored their dead, and created art that rivals anything produced by their more famous contemporaries. Golden animals dance in intricate patterns, telling stories we're only beginning to understand. Weapons of incredible craftsmanship lie beside the remains of warriors, both men and women, who lived and died as equals on the field of battle. As we begin our journey tonight, let yourself become weightless, unburdened by the concerns of the modern world. Imagine that you too are a child of the wind and grass, that your home is wherever you choose to rest for the night, and that the entire world stretches before you like an invitation to adventure. The sun is setting now over our imaginary steppe, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. The first stars are beginning to appear, and somewhere in the distance, we can hear the gentle sound of horses grazing, their bridles jingling softly in the evening breeze. A fire has been kindled, and figures are gathering around it, their faces illuminated by the dancing flames. These are our hosts for the evening, the keepers of stories that have been passed down through generations of nomadic peoples. They welcome us with the hospitality that was sacred to their culture, offering us a place by the fire and a share of their simple but nourishing meal. As we settle in among them, feeling the warmth of the flames on our faces and the vast openness of the night sky above us, we prepare to hear the tale of their people, a tale of freedom and wildness, of beauty and brutality, of a way of life that existed for over 1,000 years and then vanished like morning mist, leaving behind only whispers in the wind. The first thing you must understand about the world of the Scythians and Sarmatians is that it was a world without edges. Picture, if you will, waking each morning to a horizon that seems to curve away from you in every direction, a horizon that promises that if you could just ride far enough, fast enough, you might reach the very rim of the earth itself. This was their reality, day after day, season after season, generation after generation, that the great Eurasian steppe stretches from the grasslands of Hungary in the west to the borders of China in the east, from the frozen forests of Siberia in the north to the deserts of Central Asia in the south. It is a sea of grass, an ocean of land that rolls and flows like water, marked not by permanent features, but by the subtle signs that only those born to it can read. A slight depression that holds water after rain, a hill that offers shelter. From the wind, a grove of trees that appears like an island in the endless green dot in the depths of winter. This landscape transforms into something both beautiful and terrible. The grass disappears beneath snow that can reach the belly of a horse, and the wind carries ice crystals that sting like needles. The sky becomes a dome of pewter and steel, and the earth seems to sleep beneath its white blanket. But even in the harshest cold, life persists. The nomads knew where to find the valleys, protected from the wind, where their animals could paw through the snow to reach the dried grass beneath, where springs ran warm enough to provide water for both horse and rider. Spring arrives not with a single day of warmth, but as a gradual awakening that seems to breathe life back into the world. First, the snow begins to soften, creating streams that run silver across the dark earth. Then, almost overnight, the first green shoots push through the soil, and the steppe begins its transformation into a carpet of wildflowers that stretches beyond the power of sight to encompass. The air fills with the songs of birds returning from their southern migrations, and the horses grow sleek and strong on the new grassed-out summer on the steppe as a time of abundance and endless light. The sun rises early and sets late, painting the grassland in shades of gold and green that shift and change with every passing cloud. The air shimmers with heat during the day, but the nights are cool and perfect, filled with stars that seem to hang just beyond reach. This is when the great migrations took place, when entire peoples would pack their belongings onto wagons and horses and move across hundreds of miles in search of the best grazing for their herds. That autumn brings a different kind of beauty as the grass turns bronze and gold and the air carries the sharp scent of approaching winter. This was the time for preparation, for gathering the resources needed to survive the cold months ahead, for making the difficult decisions about which animals to keep and which to slaughter, for ensuring that enough food and fuel had been stored to last until spring returned. But it was not just the changing seasons that shaped the character of these nomadic peoples. It was the profound sense of freedom that comes from living in a world without walls, without fixed boundaries, without the need to defend a particular piece of ground at all costs. Their wealth was mobile, their homes were portable, and their loyalty was to their people and their way of life rather than to any specific location. This freedom came with its own challenges, of course. Without the protection of city walls or the certainty of cultivated fields, the nomads had to be constantly alert, constantly ready to move, constantly prepared to defend themselves and their animals from both natural dangers and human enemies. They developed a culture that prized the skill and horsemanship above all else, that valued the ability to strike swiftly and disappear just as quickly, that honored those who could navigate by the stars and find water in seemingly barren land. There, children learned to ride before they could properly walk, growing up in the saddle as naturally as city children learn to navigate streets and buildings. By the time they reached adulthood, horse and rider had become almost a single entity, capable of feats that seemed magical to those who lived more settled lives. They could sleep in the saddle during long migrations, could fight effectively while controlling their mount with their knees alone, could read the mood and health of their animals with an intuition that bordered on the supernatural. The horses themselves were not the large, heavy animals favored by later medieval knights, but smaller, hardier creatures perfectly adapted to life on the steppe. They could survive on poor forage, could travel long distances without tiring, and possessed an intelligence and loyalty that made them true partners rather than mere transportation. Many nomads valued their horses more highly than gold or silver, and the death of a beloved mount was mourned as deeply as the loss of a family member. As we sit here by our fire, feeling the night wind move through the grass around us, we begin to understand what it meant to live in such a world. There is a profound peace that comes from being part of something so vast and ancient, from knowing that the same stars that shine down on us tonight have watched over countless generations of nomadic peoples, each living their brief moment under the endless sky before passing on and becoming part of the wind that still moves across the grass. The flames of our fire dance higher now, casting flickering shadows that seem to take the shape of riders moving across the grass. In those dancing shadows, we can almost see them, the first of the great nomadic peoples to leave their mark upon the written history of the world. They called themselves something we can no longer pronounce with certainty, but the Greeks who encountered them gave them a name that has echoed through the centuries: Scythians. Imagine, if you will, the moment when these remarkable people first emerged from the vast anonymity of the steppe to become known to the civilized world. It was sometime around the 9th century, before the Common Era, when the great empires of the Mediterranean were still young and the world seemed full of mysteries waiting to be discovered. Greek traders, pushing ever further from their familiar seas, began to encounter reports of a people unlike any they had known before. The Scythians did not build cities of stone or cultivate vast fields of grain. Instead, they appeared to the settled peoples like a force of nature itself, riders who seemed to materialize from the grass as if summoned by the wind, who could strike with devastating effectiveness and then vanish back into the vastness from which they had come. They were masters of what we might call asymmetric warfare today, though they knew it simply as the way their ancestors had always fought. At the heart of their military prowess was a weapon that had been perfected over countless generations. Of life on the steppe, the composite bow. This was not the simple wooden bow familiar to forest peoples, but a marvel of ancient engineering that combined wood, sinew, and horn into a device capable of driving an arrow completely through a man, at distances that seemed impossible to their enemies. The Scythians could craft these bows so that they were powerful enough to penetrate armor, yet compact enough to be used effectively from horseback. But it was not merely the bow that made them formidable. It was the relationship between archer, bow, and horse that created something greater than the sum of its parts. A Scythian warrior could guide his mount with subtle shifts of weight and pressure from his legs, leaving both hands free to draw and loose arrows with mechanical precision. They developed techniques that allowed them to shoot accurately in any direction, even backward over their horse's rump, while retreating at full gallop, a maneuver that became so associated with them that it entered the language of warfare forever. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century before the Common Era, struggled to find words to describe what he had learned about these people. To him, they were a paradox that challenged everything he thought he knew about civilization. They possessed no cities, yet they commanded territories larger than most kingdoms. They had no written laws, yet they maintained a complex social order. They accumulated no permanent wealth, yet they created works of art that rivaled anything produced in Athens or Rome. What Herodotus and his contemporaries found most difficult to understand was that the Scythians had deliberately chosen their way of life. They were not primitive people who had simply failed to discover agriculture or architecture. They were the inheritors of a sophisticated culture that had tested its values against the harsh realities of steppe life and found them superior too. The alternatives offered by settled civilization. When Persian Emperor Darius the Great decided to extend his empire northward into Scythian territory around 513 BCE, he expected to encounter a conventional enemy that would either submit to his superior force or stand and fight in the manner of other nations he had conquered. Instead, he found himself facing an opponent that refused to play by the established rules of warfare. The Scythians would not meet his massive army in open battle, nor would they defend fixed positions that could be captured and held. Instead, they led Darius and his forces on a chase across hundreds of miles of trackless steppe, always staying just beyond reach, striking at supply lines and isolated units, then melting away before reinforcements could arrive. They poisoned wells, earned the grass to deny forage to Persian horses, and sent mocking messages to the great king, suggesting that if he truly wished to fight them, he should first find the graves of their ancestors and try to disturb them. The Persians, accustomed to campaigns that ended in decisive battles and formal surrenders, found themselves trapped in a conflict that had no clear objectives and no obvious resolution. Their supply lines stretched impossibly thin across the empty grassland. Their horses grew weak on unfamiliar forage, and their soldiers began to suffer from the psychological strain of fighting an enemy that seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. After months of futile pursuit, Darius was forced to withdraw his forces, having achieved nothing but the loss of thousands of men and immense quantities of supplies. The Scythians had won without ever committing to a major battle, proving that their way of war was not merely effective but revolutionary. They had shown that mobility and knowledge of the terrain could triumph over numerical superiority and advanced technology. But the Scythians were not merely warriors. Archaeological evidence has revealed that they were also skilled metallurgists, capable of working not only iron for their weapons and tools, but also gold and silver for objects of stunning beauty and complexity. Their smiths could create steel that was superior to anything produced in the Mediterranean world, forging swords and arrowheads that held their edge through countless battles and remained sharp for centuries after their owners had died. They were also master craftsmen in leather and felt, materials that might seem humble, but which they transformed into works of art. Their horse gear was decorated with intricate patterns that told stories of hunts and battles, of mythical creatures, and sacred ceremonies. Their clothing was designed not only for protection against the elements, but as a display of personal status and tribal identity. Perhaps most remarkably, they had developed techniques for preserving their most precious possessions through the harsh winters of the steppe. In the permanently frozen ground of Siberia, archaeologists have discovered Scythian burial sites where organic materials have been preserved as if they were created yesterday. Elaborate tapestries, clothing made from silk that must have traveled thousands of miles along ancient trade routes, and even tattooed human skin have survived to tell us about a people whose sophistication far exceeded what ancient historians imagined. As our fire burns lower and the night grows deeper around us, we can picture these remarkable people in their daily lives. A Scythian camp would have been a marvel of efficiency and organization, with felt tents that could be erected or struck in minutes, wagons designed to carry entire households across vast distances, and herds of animals that represented not just wealth, but the foundation of survival itself. The children would have grown up surrounded by the constant movement and activity of nomadic life, learning from infancy the skills they would need to thrive in their demanding environment. They would have known the names and bloodlines of hundreds of horses, understood the subtle signs that predicted changes in weather, and absorbed through daily practice the complex knowledge needed to navigate across featureless terrain. The women of Scythian society held a status that was remarkable for its time, serving not only as the keepers of domestic life, but as warriors, priestesses, and leaders in their own right. Archaeological evidence suggests that Scythian women often rode to war alongside their men, and some were buried with the full honors accorded to great warriors, surrounded by weapons and armor that showed clear signs of use in battle. As sleep begins to claim us here beside the dying embers of our fire, we can almost hear the distant sound of hoofbeats on the grass, the creak of leather and jingle of harness that announce the approach of these lords of the iron bow. They are riding toward us through the centuries, these Scythians, carrying with them the wild freedom of the steppe and the proud knowledge that they had chosen the harder path and found it good. The embers of our fire glow like tiny stars fallen to earth, and in their gentle light, we begin to see more clearly the true nature of these people who have captured our imagination. For too long, the Scythians were known to the world only through the words of their enemies and the assumptions of settled peoples who could not understand their choices. But the earth itself has become their storyteller, yielding up treasures that speak more eloquently than any ancient historian ever could. Beneath the rolling grasslands of Ukraine, Russia, and Kazakhstan, archaeologists have discovered burial mounds called kurgans, great earthen hills that rise from the steppe like sleeping giants. From the outside, these mounds appear to be nothing more than natural features of the landscape, gentle swells in the earth that might have been shaped by wind and weather over countless centuries. But within their hearts lie chambers that preserve the most intimate details of Scythian life and death. When we descend into these ancient tombs, we enter a world that glitters with gold and speaks of beliefs that connected the living with the cosmos itself. The Scythians buried their dead, not as endings, but as transformations, surrounding them with everything they would need for a journey that extended far beyond the boundaries of mortal existence. Warriors went to their rest accompanied by their horses, their weapons still sharp and ready, their bodies adorned with golden ornaments that caught and held the last light of the world above. But it is not merely the quantity of gold that takes our breath away. It is the artistry, the incredible skill and imagination that transformed precious metal into a language of symbols and stories. Scythian goldsmiths created miniature worlds populated by creatures both real and mythical, scenes of hunting and warfare, of ceremony and daily life, all rendered with a delicacy and attention to detail that rivals the finest work of any civilization. Look closely at a Scythian golden plaque, and you might see an eagle gripping a fish in its talons, every feather individually crafted, every scale on the fish's body carefully defined. Or perhaps a scene of horsemen in flowing robes, their mounts captured in mid-gallop, manes streaming in an eternal wind. These were not mere decorations, but sacred images that carried deep meaning for their creators, visual prayers that were meant to accompany the dead on their journey to whatever realm awaited them, the animals that appear most frequently in Scythian art tell us much about their worldview and their spiritual beliefs. Stags with elaborate antlers that branch like the rivers of paradise, snow leopards whose spotted coats seem to mirror the star-filled sky, eagles whose spread wings encompass the vault of heaven itself. These creatures were not chosen randomly, but represented different aspects of the cosmic order that the Scythians believed governed all existence. The stag, in particular, held special significance as a guide between worlds, a creature that could traverse the boundary between the earthly realm and the spiritual domain beyond. The elaborate antlers that Scythian artists gave to their golden stags were not naturalistic representations, but symbolic forests that grew in the land of the dead, offering shelter and sustenance to souls making their final journey. But the Scythians did not reserve their artistry for precious metals alone. They were master craftsmen in every material that their nomadic lifestyle made available to them. Leather was transformed into intricate tapestries that told stories of great hunts and legendary heroes. Felt was shaped and dyed into carpets and dyed. Wall hangings that could transform the interior of a simple tent into a palace worthy of kings. Their clothing, too, was a form of artistic expression, with every garment serving as a canvas for elaborate decoration. Scythian nobles wore robes embroidered with golden thread, trousers decorated with spiraling patterns that seemed to flow like wind-blown grass, and boots that were works of art in their own right, crafted from soft leather and adorned with precious stones and metal fittings. The discovery of tattooed mummies in the frozen tombs of Siberia has revealed yet another dimension of Scythian artistic expression. These ancient bodies, preserved by the perpetual ice of high mountain valleys, show us that the Scythians used their own skin as a canvas, covering themselves with intricate designs that held both decorative and spiritual significance. Warriors bore tattoos of the animals whose spirits they hoped would guide them in battle, while shamans and spiritual leaders marked themselves with symbols that denoted their role as intermediaries between the human and divine realms. The process of creating these tattoos must have been both painful and profound, a rite of passage that connected the individual to their community and their beliefs in the most intimate way possible. The pigments were made from soot and other natural materials, carefully worked into the skin with bone needles and patterns that had been passed down through generations of artists and spiritual practitioners. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Scythian culture was the role that women played in their society. The burial mounds have yielded the remains of female warriors, buried with full military honors, their graves containing weapons that show clear signs of use in battle, their bodies bearing the same battle scars that marked their male counterparts. These were not ceremonial burials, but the final resting places of women who had lived and died as warriors, equal participants in the dangerous and demanding life of the steppe. Some of these warrior women were buried with such elaborate grave goods and in such prominent locations that they must have held positions of significant leadership within their communities. Their tombs contain not only weapons and armor, but also the symbols of religious authority, suggesting that they served as both military commanders and spiritual leaders, wielding temporal and sacred power with equal skill. The Greek historians who wrote about the Scythians were fascinated and somewhat disturbed by these accounts of female warriors, which seemed to confirm their legends of the Amazons, the mythical women warriors who supposedly lived at the edges of the known world. But for the Scythians, the participation of women in warfare was not mythical but practical, a natural consequence of their nomadic lifestyle where every member of the tribe might be called upon to defend their people and their animals from enemies. Children of Scythian society grew up surrounded by this culture of artistic expression and martial skill. From infancy, they would have been exposed to the intricate beauty of their parents' possessions, learning to appreciate the craftsmanship that went into every object, from the simplest leather bridle to the most elaborate golden ornament. They would have absorbed the stories told by the patterns and symbols that decorated their world, understanding instinctively the meanings that were embedded in every design dot. As they grew older, these children would have begun their own apprenticeships in the arts of their people, learning from master craftsmen how to work leather and felt, how to shape metal and mix pigments, how to create the objects that would both serve practical purposes and express the deepest beliefs of their culture. They would have learned that every creation was both a work of art and a form of prayer, a way of participating in the cosmic order that governed their existence. The burial practices of the Scythians reveal a people who believed deeply in the continuity of existence, who saw death not as an ending, but as a transformation from one state of being to another. The elaborate preparations for burial, the careful arrangement of grave goods, the sacrifice of horses and sometimes human retainers to accompany the deceased, all speak of a conviction that the journey continued beyond the boundaries of mortal life. As we rest here in the gentle darkness, feeling the vast presence of the steppe around us, We can almost sense the spirits of these ancient artists and warriors, their essence somehow woven into the very fabric of the landscape they loved. Their golden treasures may rest in museums now, separated from the grass and sky that gave them meaning. But their true legacy lives on in the wind that still moves across the endless grassland, carrying with it the whisper of their stories and the echo of their dreams. The night deepens around us, and in the quietness that follows the settling of our fire, we hear a different sound carried on the wind. It is not the heavy thunder of male warriors charging across the plain, but something lighter, yet no less formidable. Listen carefully, and you might catch the whisper of arrows cutting through air, the soft percussion of hoofbeats that speak of riders who move with the fluid grace of dancers, even as they carry death in their quivers. These are the sounds that would have announced the approach of the most legendary figures in all of Scythian society, the warrior women, whose existence seemed so extraordinary to the ancient world that they became the foundation for myths that have never truly died. The Greeks called them Amazons, imagining them as a separate race of women who lived apart from men, who cut off their right breasts to draw their bows more easily, who ruled a kingdom at the very edge of the known world. But the reality, as archaeology has revealed to us, was both more complex and more remarkable than any myth. The warrior women of the Scythian world were not creatures of legend, but flesh and blood human beings who lived, fought, and died alongside their male counterparts as equals in a society that measured worth by skill and courage rather than by gender alone. In the burial mounds scattered across the steppes, researchers have found the graves of women who were clearly warriors, their skeletons bearing the distinctive marks of a life spent in the saddle and in battle. Their arm bones show the characteristic asymmetrical development that comes from years of drawing a powerful bow. Their leg bones reveal the curved shape that develops in those who spend most of their lives on horseback, and their skulls sometimes bear the scars of combat wounds that healed during life, testament to battles survived and victories won. One such burial, discovered in the Pokrovka cemetery in southern Russia, contained the remains of a woman who had lived to middle age despite having received multiple serious wounds throughout her life. Her grave goods included a bronze arrowhead that had been surgically removed from her body and carefully placed beside her in death, perhaps as a trophy of a particularly memorable battle. She was buried with her weapons, her horse gear, and golden ornaments that marked her as a person of high status within her community. But it was not merely their participation in warfare that made these women remarkable. Archaeological evidence suggests that some held positions of supreme leadership, ruling over territories that encompassed thousands of square miles and commanding the loyalty of both male and female warriors. These were not merely exceptions to the general rule, but representatives of a cultural tradition that recognized leadership ability wherever it manifested itself. The most famous of these female rulers was discovered in a burial mound near the modern city of Rostov-on-Don. The tomb, which archaeologists have dubbed the grave of the Amazon Queen, contained the remains of a woman who had been buried with unprecedented wealth and ceremony. Her body was adorned with over 4 pounds of gold ornaments, including a magnificent headdress that must have made her appear almost divine to those who beheld her in life. But it was not just the quantity of gold that marked her as extraordinary. The objects buried with her told the story of a life lived at the very pinnacle of Scythian society. She had been interred with weapons that showed clear signs of use, including a sword whose blade had been notched in combat and carefully repaired. Her bow was a masterwork of the weapon maker's art, crafted from materials that had been gathered from across the known world and assembled by a master who understood that this would be wielded by someone whose life might depend on its perfection. The Amazon Queen's burial chamber also contained evidence of her role as a spiritual leader. Among her grave goods were objects that archaeologists interpret as shamanic tools, mirrors that might have been used for divination, vessels for the preparation of sacred substances, and amulets that would have connected her to the spiritual forces that governed the world of the steppe. But perhaps most remarkably, she had been buried with attendants, both male and female, who had apparently chosen to accompany her into death. This was not human sacrifice in the brutal sense that we might imagine, but rather a voluntary acceptance of death by those who served her, a testament to the loyalty and devotion that she had inspired during her lifetime. The stories that these archaeological discoveries tell us paint a picture of a society where women could rise to positions of power and influence that were unimaginable in most ancient civilizations. While Greek women were expected to remain in their homes, managing domestic affairs, but playing no role in public life, and while Roman women, despite their greater freedoms, were still legally subordinate to their male relatives, Scythian women could command armies, rule territories, and participate fully in all aspects of their society's most important activities. This equality appears to have extended to childhood as well. Scythian girls were trained in horsemanship and archery alongside their brothers, learning the skills that would allow them to contribute to their people's survival and prosperity. They grew up understanding that their value to their community would be measured not by their ability to conform to restrictive gender roles, but by their competence in the demanding tasks that steppe life required of everyone. The training of a Scythian warrior woman would have begun almost as soon as she could sit upright on a horse. She would have learned first to stay mounted while her horse moved at various gaits, then to guide the animal with subtle shifts of weight and pressure while leaving her hands free for other tasks. Gradually, she would have progressed to the complex skills required for mounted archery, the ability to nock, draw, and loose arrows accurately while controlling a moving horse, often while that horse was galloping at full speed across uneven terrain. But archery was only one part of her education. She would also have learned to fight with sword and spear, to use the momentum of her charging horse to add devastating force to her attacks, and to coordinate her movements with those of other riders in the complex maneuvers that made Scythian cavalry so effective. She would have studied the art of tracking, learning to read the subtle signs that revealed the passage of game, animals or enemy warriors across the seemingly featureless grassland. Perhaps most importantly, she would have absorbed the psychological qualities that made Scythian warriors so formidable: the ability to remain calm and focused in the chaos of battle, the willingness to take calculated risks when the situation demanded it, and the deep confidence that came from knowing that her skills had been tested and proven in the most demanding environment imaginable. The Greek historians who wrote about these warrior women struggled to understand how such a society could function. Their own cultural assumptions made it difficult for them to imagine women participating as equals in activities that they considered inherently masculine. They created elaborate explanations for what they observed, suggesting that the Amazons were a separate race, or that they had been cursed by the gods to live apart from normal human society. But the truth was simpler and more profound than their explanations. The Scythians had created a culture that valued practical ability over theoretical gender roles, that recognized that survival on the steppe required the full participation of every capable individual, regardless of their sex. In such a society, artificial restrictions based on gender were not just impractical, but potentially fatal. The legacy of these warrior women extends far beyond the boundaries of their own time and place. They became the inspiration for countless stories and legends, from the classical myths of the Amazons to the medieval tales of female knights and the modern narratives of women warriors that continue to capture our imagination. They prove that courage, skill, and leadership are human qualities that transcend the arbitrary divisions that societies often try to impose. As we lie here under the vast canopy of stars, feeling the cool night air move across the grass around us, we can almost see them riding toward us through the darkness. These warrior queens of the ancient steppe, their hair streaming behind them. Like banners, their eyes bright with the fierce joy of those who have found their true calling. They carry with them the message that strength comes in many forms, that leadership emerges wherever it is needed, and that the human spirit, regardless of the body that contains it, yearns always toward freedom and the chance to prove itself worthy of the infinite sky above. The stars wheel slowly overhead as the night deepens around our dying fire, and in the vast silence of the steppe we sense a change beginning to stir. Like the subtle shift in the wind that tells an experienced nomad that the weather is about to turn, there are signs that the age of Scythian dominance is drawing toward its close. From the eastern reaches of the grassland, beyond the rivers that mark the edges of the known world, new riders are approaching, their hoofbeats growing steadily stronger as they move across the endless sea of grass dot. These newcomers call themselves by names that will echo through history: Sarmatians, Sarumate, Alans, Roxolani. They are cousins to the Scythians in blood and culture, children of the same endless steppe, shaped by the same harsh beauty of the grassland world. Yet they bring with them innovations and traditions that will transform the art of mounted warfare and leave their mark on civilizations from Britain to the borders of China. The emergence of the Sarmatians as a dominant force on the western steppe was not a sudden conquest, but a gradual process that unfolded over several centuries, beginning around the 4th century before the Common Era. They did not sweep down upon the Scythians like an invading army, but rather pressed westward in the same way that grass bends before a steady wind, with persistence and patience rather than dramatic violence. Picture, if you will, the vast migrations that must have preceded this gradual takeover. Entire tribes moving across hundreds of miles of grassland, their wagons creaking under the weight of their portable homes, their herds stretching to the horizon in every direction. These were not desperate refugees fleeing from disaster, but confident people seeking new opportunities, new grazing grounds, new territories where they could prosper and grow strong. The Sarmatians brought with them refinements to the nomadic way of life that represented centuries of experimentation and innovation. Their horses were bred for size and strength, capable of carrying the weight of armored riders across vast distances without tiring. Their weapons were crafted with a precision that surpassed even the legendary skill of Scythian smiths, and their tactics had evolved to take advantage of changes in the wider world of warfare. Most significantly, the Sarmatians had perfected the use of heavy cavalry in a way that would revolutionize military thinking for centuries to come. While the Scythians had been masters of the mounted archer, striking from a distance and relying on mobility to avoid close combat, the Sarmatians developed techniques that allowed them to charge directly into enemy formations with devastating effect. Their warriors wore armor that was unlike anything seen before on the steppe. Scale armor made from small iron plates sewn onto leather backing provided protection that was both flexible and strong, allowing the rider to move freely while deflecting arrows and sword blows that would have been fatal to an unprotected man. Some Sarmatian nobles wore armor so elaborate and effective that Greek and Roman observers compared them to iron giants, beings more metal than flesh. But it was not just the riders who were armored. The Sarmatians also developed protective gear for their horses, creating what may have been the world's first true heavy cavalry. These armored horses, called cataphracts, could charge into a formation of infantry with the force of a battering ram, their iron-shod hooves crushing those who fell beneath them, their riders striking down with long lances that could penetrate shields and armor with ease. The psychological effect of these charges must have been devastating. Imagine being a foot soldier standing in formation with your comrades, watching as a line of these armored riders approached at full gallop. The ground would shake beneath your feet. The air would fill with the thunder of hoofbeats and the jingling of metal. And bearing down upon you would come what appeared to be creatures from a nightmare, half man and half beast, encased in iron. And seemingly unstoppable. Yet, for all their innovations in heavy cavalry tactics, the Sarmatians had not abandoned the traditional skills of steppe warfare. They remained master archers, capable of the same feats of mounted archery that had made their Scythian predecessors so formidable. A Sarmatian army could switch seamlessly between different tactical approaches, charging with heavy cavalry when the situation favored close combat, or reverting to the traditional hit-and-run archery attacks when mobility was more important than shock value. This tactical flexibility made them incredibly dangerous opponents for the settled civilizations that bordered the steppe. Roman generals, accustomed to enemies who fought in predictable ways, found themselves facing an opponent who could change the nature of battle at will, transforming from mounted archers to heavy cavalry and back again as circumstances required. The Sarmatians also brought with them cultural innovations that reflected their Eastern origins and their contacts with civilizations that lay beyond the traditional sphere of Greek and Roman knowledge. Their art showed influences from Persia, from the distant kingdoms of Central Asia, and from peoples whose names were unknown to Mediterranean historians. They worked with silk that must have traveled thousands of miles along trade routes that connected the grasslands to the markets of China and India. Their burial practices, while similar in many ways to those of the Scythians, showed distinctive features that spoke of different spiritual beliefs and social structures. Sarmatian tombs often contained evidence of a more hierarchical society, with greater differences in wealth and status between different levels of the social order. The graves of Sarmatian nobles were filled with objects that demonstrated their connections to distant lands and exotic cultures, while the burials of common warriors, though still respectful, were noticeably simpler. The women of Sarmatian society appear to have maintained the warrior traditions that had been so prominent among the Scythians, but with some important differences. Archaeological evidence suggests that while Sarmatian women continued to participate in warfare and to hold positions of leadership, their roles may have become somewhat more specialized and formalized than had been the case in earlier periods. Sarmatian female burials contain weapons and horse gear that suggest these women served as specialized cavalry commanders, leading units of heavy cataphracts in the same way that their male counterparts did. Others contain objects that appear to be associated with religious or shamanic functions, suggesting that some Sarmatian women held important spiritual roles within their communities. As the Sarmatians gradually established their dominance over the western steppe, they did not simply replace the Scythians, but rather absorbed many of them into their own tribal confederations. This process of cultural blending created new hybrid groups that combined the best elements of both traditions, resulting in a nomadic culture that was even more sophisticated and militarily effective than either of its parent civilizations had been alone. The rise of the Sarmatians coincided with a period of great upheaval in the wider world. The campaigns of Alexander the Great had shattered the old Persian Empire, creating a power vacuum in much of Central Asia. The Roman Republic was expanding eastward, bringing its legions into contact with peoples they had never encountered before. The ancient kingdoms of the Near East were struggling to maintain their independence in the face of pressure from multiple directions. Into this chaotic world, the Sarmatians emerged as a new force that could not be ignored. Their cavalry was superior to anything that the Mediterranean powers could field. Their mobility allowed them to strike where and when they chose, and their knowledge of the vast grasslands gave them strategic advantages that their enemies could not match. As we rest here in the peaceful darkness, feeling the gentle movement of night air across the grass, we can sense the approach of these new riders from the east. They bring with them the promise of change, the inevitability of transformation that is as natural as the turning of the seasons. The age of the Scythians is ending, but the age of the Sarmatians is about to begin, and with it will come new stories, new legends, new ways of understanding what it means to be free under the endless sky of the steppe. As the 2nd century dawned across the Roman world, the great philosopher-emperor Marcus Aurelius found himself facing challenges that would test the very foundations of his empire. Along the northern borders, where the mighty Danube River carved its ancient path through the landscape, tribes were stirring with restless energy. Among them, the Sarmatians had grown bold, their swift horses carrying them in raids that struck like lightning and vanished like morning mist. But Marcus Aurelius was not merely a ruler of stone and steel. He was a man who understood the art of transformation, of turning enemies into allies, adversaries into assets. In the year 174, when Roman legions crossed the cold waters of the Danube to face the Sarmatian tribes, they carried with them not just the expectation of conquest, but the seeds of something far more profound. Picture, if you will, the meeting of two worlds. On one side, the disciplined ranks of Roman infantry, their bronze armor gleaming in the pale northern sun, their formations precise as geometric patterns carved in marble. On the other, the fluid grace of Sarmatian cavalry, their scale armor rippling like serpent skin, their long lances catching the light as they wheeled and charged across the grasslands they called home. The battles were fierce, yet brief, for the Sarmatians, despite their skill and courage, found themselves facing an empire that had learned to bend rather than break, to absorb rather than simply destroy. When the dust settled and the terms of peace were negotiated, something remarkable occurred. Marcus Aurelius, in his wisdom, did not merely demand tribute or hostages. Instead, he recruited 5,500 Sarmatian cavalrymen into Roman service. And in 175 AD, he sent them across the width of Europe to a misty island at the edge of the known world, Britain. Imagine the emotions that stirred in the hearts of these warriors as they left their endless steppes behind. No longer would they wake to the sight of grass stretching to every horizon. No longer would they sleep under stars that had watched over their ancestors for countless generations. Instead, they would serve beneath the red and gold standards of Rome, in a land of rolling hills and ancient stones, where the very air seemed to whisper of older magics. This unit of Sarmatian cavalry was not merely a temporary military arrangement. They remained in Britain for generations, their presence recorded in Roman documents well into the 5th century. Think of what this meant, dear listener. Fathers taught sons the old ways of horsemanship while learning new ways of war. Mothers sang lullabies in the ancient tongue while their children played among Roman ruins and Celtic roundhouses. These were men who carried within their very souls the memory of infinite spaces, now stationed in the northern reaches of Hadrian's Wall, watching over a landscape that must have seemed both alien and strangely familiar. The moors of northern England, with their vast expanses and wild beauty, perhaps reminded them just enough of home to ease the ache of exile, while remaining different enough to feel like a constant, gentle dream. And what traditions did they bring with them, these riders from the steppe? They brought the memory of their ancestors' reverence for swords, the belief that a blade was more than mere metal. It was the soul of a warrior made manifest. They brought rituals of brotherhood, forged in the heat of battle and sealed with sacred oaths. They brought the concept of loyalty that transcended death itself, the kind of devotion that would follow a beloved leader into the shadowy realm beyond the sunset dot in the quiet moments between their duties. When the northern winds carried the scent of heather across the land, these Sarmatian soldiers must have shared their stories. Stories of warrior queens who could split arrows in flight, tales of magical swords that could cut through any armor, legends of heroes who gathered around great leaders, bound by oaths of honor and brotherhood that no force on earth could break. The Sarmatians gradually merged with the Celtic and Romano-British population, and there is compelling evidence that this Sarmatian presence in Britain provides the historical foundation for the legend of King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table. Picture this transformation taking place over decades, like the slow changing of seasons across the centuries. The descendants of steppe warriors, now speaking Latin and Celtic tongues, yet still remembering the ancient ways. Their children played games that echoed the mounted warfare of distant ancestors, while their grandchildren grew up as Britons, who nonetheless carried in their blood the fierce independence of the steppes. There was, according to historical records, a Roman military commander named Lucius Artorius Castus, who led a group of Sarmatian warriors in northern Britain around 182 AD. After his death, he became fused with various Sarmatian heroes and acquired a collection of stories that would ultimately evolve into the legend of King Arthur. Can you see it, dear listener? Can you envision how the threads of history weave themselves into the tapestries we call legend? A Roman officer with a name that would echo through centuries, leading warriors whose traditions spoke of round shields and circular formations, of loyalty bonds that created kinship stronger than blood, of magical blades and quests for sacred vessels dot the round table. That powerful symbol of equality and brotherhood may have had its origins in the Sarmatian tradition of warriors gathering in circles around their campfires, where no man sat higher than another, where decisions were made by council rather than decree. The very concept of knights bound by sacred oaths, riding forth on individual quests, yet united in common cause, resonates with the ancient Sarmatian understanding of warrior brotherhood. And what of their fighting techniques? These masters of mounted warfare? Roman military manuals began to change, incorporating lessons learned from Sarmatian tactics. The heavy cavalry that would later dominate medieval battlefields traced its lineage back to these armored horsemen from the steppes. The long cavalry lance, the protective scale armor, the emphasis on nobility combined with striking power. All of these became hallmarks of European warfare in the centuries that followed. Even their spiritual practices found fertile ground. In British soil, the Sarmatian reverence for sacred swords, for oaths sworn upon steel, for the mystical connection between warrior and blade, blended with Celtic traditions of magical weapons and sacred quests. Some scholars suggest that even the legends of the Holy Grail may have Sarmatian origins, transformed through centuries of storytelling and cultural blending. But perhaps most remarkably, these warriors from the steppes brought with them something that would prove more enduring than any military technique or political alliance. They brought the idea that true nobility comes not from birth alone, but from deeds performed in service of a higher cause. That honor is measured not by wealth accumulated, but by loyalty demonstrated and promises kept. The Knights of Arthur likely consisted of Latinized and Celticized descendants of Sarmatian mercenaries, along with Celtic cavalrymen who had learned to fight in the Sarmatian manner. Thus, the very foundation of the Arthurian ideal, the notion of the knight-errant, the warrior-monk, the defender of the innocent, may have been born from the marriage of steppe traditions with British soil as the Roman Empire began its long retreat from Britain. In the early 5th century, these Sarmatian descendants found themselves in a unique position. No longer bound by imperial service, yet deeply rooted in their adopted homeland, they became something entirely new. They were the bridge between the classical world and the medieval one, between the ancient traditions of the steppes and the Trenthes. Emerging legends of the British Isles, the winds that blow across the Yorkshire Dales and the Scottish Highlands today still carry whispers of their presence. In the stones of ruined Roman forts, in the earthworks that crown ancient hills, in the very names of villages and streams, the legacy of the Sarmatians endures. They came as foreign soldiers in service to a distant emperor, but they became something far more precious. They became the keepers of stories that would inspire countless generations. Their horses may have long since returned to dust. Their armor may have crumbled into rust, but their spirit lives on in every tale of knightly valor, in every story of brotherhood forged in adversity, in every legend that speaks of heroes who ride forth to defend the innocent and uphold the right. And so, dear listener, as you drift toward sleep, let your dreams carry you to those misty moorlands where Sarmatian cavalry once patrolled the edges of empire. Feel the phantom hoofbeats echoing across the centuries. Hear the distant sound of harness leather and the soft nickering of war horses. In your dreams, you might glimpse them still, proud figures on horseback, silhouetted against the northern sky, guardians of memory and myth, keepers of the eternal flame that transforms history into legend. The fire burns lower now, its embers glowing like distant stars, and in that gentle light, we prepare to continue our journey deeper into the realm of dreams and distant memories. But first, let us pause and listen to the wind, for it carries with it the voices of those ancient warriors, whispering still of honor, loyalty, and the enduring power of stories to transcend the boundaries of time itself. To understand the souls of the Scythians and Sarmatians, we must look beyond their earthly deeds and peer into the realm of their deepest beliefs. For these were not merely warriors and herders, but people whose entire existence was woven through with threads of the sacred, whose daily lives pulsed with the rhythms of ceremony and reverence, whose understanding of the world extended far beyond what mortal eyes could see. Picture, if you will, a warm summer evening on the steppes, when the last light of day lingers like golden honey on the horizon. The camp has settled into its evening rhythm, horses grazing peacefully in the gathering dusk, cooking fires sending thin columns of smoke toward the first appearing stars. But tonight is different. Tonight, the shamans prepare for one of their most sacred rituals, and the very air seems to shimmer with anticipation. At the heart of their pantheon stood Tabidi, the great goddess of fire and hearth, whose name meant the Flaming One, the Burning One. She was not merely a deity to be worshipped from afar, but a living presence in every flame that warmed their dwellings, in every spark that brought life to tinder, in every sacred fire that burned at the center of their most important ceremonies. When the wind caught the flames and sent them dancing skyward, the people knew they were witnessing Tabidi's own spirit ascending toward the heavens. The Scythian and Sarmatian religious system was built around 7 primary deities, a sacred number that connected them to the ancient Indo-Iranian traditions that had shaped the spiritual landscape of the steppes for countless generations. Beyond Tabidi, there was Papayas, often called Father, a sky god whose domain stretched from horizon to horizon. Api, the earth goddess, was his divine consort, and together they represented the eternal marriage between sky and earth that gave birth to all living things. Among their other deities were gods of the sun, war, and horses, forces that shaped every aspect of steppe life. The sun god rode across the heavens in his eternal chariot, bringing light and warmth to the endless grasslands. The war god blessed their weapons and gave courage to their hearts in battle. And the horse god, perhaps most sacred of all to these, people of the steppes, watched over the magnificent creatures that were not merely their companions, but extensions of their very souls. But the divine realm was not distant from daily life. Every morning, as the first rays of sunlight painted the eastern sky, families would emerge from their felt tents to greet the sun with ancient prayers. Every evening, as darkness began to claim the land, they would kindle their fires not merely for warmth and cooking, but as acts of communion with Tabidi herself. The ancient writers tell us that these people were known as fire worshippers, and that they also revered rivers and flowing water as divine beings. The great rivers that carved their way across the steppes, the Don, the Dnieper, the Volga, were not merely sources of water, but living gods with their own personalities, their own desires, their own power to bless or curse those who dwelt along their banks. In the flickering light of evening fires, the shamans would begin their most profound work. These were not ordinary priests bound by rigid hierarchies and written doctrines, but individuals who had been called by the spirits. Themselves, men and women who could walk between the worlds of the seen and unseen, the mortal and the divine. The use of cannabis to induce spiritual trances was a characteristic feature of Scythian religious practice, as recorded by the ancient Greek historian Herodotus. In specially constructed tent-like structures, the shamans would place glowing coals in bronze braziers, then cast hemp seeds upon the heated metal. As the aromatic smoke filled the enclosed space, they would enter into profound altered states of consciousness, their souls freed to journey into realms beyond ordinary perception. Imagine witnessing such a ceremony, dear listener. The shaman sits in perfect stillness as the sacred smoke swirls around him, his breathing deep and rhythmical, his eyes closed, but somehow seeing visions that span vast distances of space and time. Around him, the community waits in respectful silence, knowing that their spiritual guide is traveling to the realm of the ancestors, seeking wisdom, healing, or prophecy. Some of these shamans were the mysterious Inare, sacred figures who dressed in women's clothing and carried ornate scepters topped with rattles and carved animal figures. They wore antlered headdresses that connected them to the deer and elk of the northern forests, creatures that served as spiritual messengers between the earthly and celestial realms. The rhythm of their rattles matched the heartbeat of the earth itself, calling forth the spirits and opening doorways between dimensions. In their trance states, these shamans could speak with the voices of the dead, offering comfort to the grieving and guidance to the living. They could see the patterns of weather forming far beyond the horizon, warning their people of coming storms or promising the end of harsh winters. They could diagnose illnesses not just of the body, but of the soul, prescribing rituals and ceremonies that would restore harmony between the individual and the cosmic order. The spiritual practices of these steppe peoples were intimately connected to the rhythms of nature. They understood that human life was but one note in the vast symphony of existence, and that true wisdom came from learning to harmonize with all the other voices in that cosmic chorus. The migration patterns of birds, the changing phases of the moon, the movement of constellations across the seasonal sky, all of these were texts to be read by those with eyes to see. Their burial practices reveal the depth of their spiritual beliefs. The Sarmatians would often cover graves with the remnants of ritual bonfires, creating a connection between the earthly remains and the sacred fire that they believed would guide souls to the afterlife. These were not mere funeral rites, but elaborate ceremonies designed to ensure safe passage for the deceased into the realm of the ancestors. Picture a Sarmatian funeral taking place under the star-filled dome of night. The body of the departed warrior lies in state, surrounded by his most precious possessions, his weapons, his horse gear, vessels of kumis for the journey ahead. Around the burial mound, the entire community gathers, their voices raised in ancient chants that their grandparents' had sung at similar ceremonies. The shamans move in slow, ritualistic patterns around the grave, their antlered headdresses casting strange shadows in the firelight. They carry sacred herbs that release purifying smoke when cast into the flames. The fire itself becomes a living prayer, its ascending smoke carrying the souls of the dead upward toward the eternal blue sky that was their ultimate destination. Sarmatian priestesses were buried with mirrors, symbols of the feminine principle and the mystical connection between the earthly and spiritual realms. These polished bronze discs were not merely ornamental, but magical tools that could reflect not just physical images, but spiritual truths. In the hands of a skilled priestess, such a mirror could reveal the location of lost objects, the identity of thieves, or the fate of warriors who had not returned from distant raids. The spiritual calendar of the steppes was marked by ceremonies that celebrated the eternal cycles of death and rebirth. At the spring equinox, when the grass began to green and the mares gave birth to their foals, great festivals honored the return of life to the world. At the summer solstice, when the sun reached the height of its power, special fires were kindled that burned for 3 days and 3 nights, their light visible for many miles across the prairie. The autumn ceremonies prepared the community for the challenges of winter, with rituals of thanksgiving for the year's blessings and prayers for protection during the dark months ahead. And in the depths of winter, when the world lay locked in ice and snow, the shamans would kindle special fires whose flames were believed to keep the spark of life alive until spring returned. These were not primitive superstitions, but sophisticated spiritual technologies developed over millennia of intimate connection with the natural world. The shamans understood that consciousness was not limited to ordinary waking awareness, but could be expanded through disciplined practice to encompass cosmic dimensions of being. They knew that healing required addressing not just physical symptoms, but the spiritual imbalances that caused illness in the first place. In their worldview, every object possessed its own spirit. Every sword carried the essence of all the warriors who had wielded it. Every horse held within its noble heart the memories of all the races it had run, all the battles it had carried its rider through. When a master craftsman forged a blade, he was not merely shaping metal, but creating a vessel for spiritual power that would grow stronger with each honorable deed performed with that weapon. The very landscape itself was alive with spiritual presence. Certain hills were known to be dwelling places of powerful spirits, and travelers would leave offerings of food or small treasures when passing such sacred sites. Springs that bubbled up from deep within the earth were considered to be doorways to the underworld, places where the shamans could communicate with the spirits of the deep places. Ancient groves of trees, especially those that had been struck by lightning and survived, were recognized as temples where the sky gods had touched the earth. The Scythians and Sarmatians would tie cloth strips to the branches of such trees, each piece of fabric carrying a prayer or wish that would flutter in the wind until the gods heard and answered not as you drift toward sleep. Dear listener, let your imagination carry you to one of those sacred groves, where ancient oaks spread their gnarled branches against a sky brilliant with stars. Feel the soft whisper of wind through the leaves, carrying with it the prayers of countless generations. See the strips of cloth dancing in the breeze, each one a message of hope sent toward the infinite sky. Listen closely, and perhaps you will hear the distant sound of drums echoing across the centuries, the shaman's rattles keeping time with the eternal heartbeat of the earth. In your dreams, you might glimpse the sacred fires still burning on the steps of memory, tended by spirits who remember the old ways, who keep alive the ancient wisdom of a people who knew that the boundary between the earthly and divine was as thin as morning mist. The fire before us burns lower now, its flames settling into gentle, hypnotic patterns that seem to pulse with the rhythm of some cosmic breath. In that dancing light, we can almost see them still, the shamans and priestesses, the fire keepers and dream walkers, guardians of mysteries that connect us all to the sacred source from which all life flows, and to which all spirits eventually return. To speak of the Scythians and Sarmatians is to speak of a civilization that communicated through imagery as much as through words, whose deepest truths were expressed not in scrolls or tablets, but in the flowing lines of what we now call the animal style, a visual language so powerful and enduring that its echoes still resonate in the artistic traditions of cultures scattered across the vast Eurasian continent. Imagine, if you will, a master craftsman working by the light of an oil flame in the deep of a winter night. His weathered hands shape the bronze with infinite patience, each hammer blow guided by knowledge passed down through generations. He is not merely creating ornament, but giving form to the spirits themselves, translating the mysteries of the steppe into metal that will gleam like captured starlight. The animal style that emerged from the steppes between the 7th and 3rd centuries BC was unlike any other artistic tradition the world had known. Where other civilizations might depict their gods in human form, these people of the grasslands saw The divine manifested in the creatures that shared their world. The swift deer, the powerful elk, the fierce griffins and snow leopards that haunted both their dreams and their waking hours. But this was not simple naturalistic representation. The animals that flowed across Scythian and Sarmatian metalwork, textiles and tattoos were transformed through the lens of spiritual vision into something far more profound. A deer's antlers might themselves be carved to resemble smaller creatures, creating endless spirals of life within life. A griffin's claws might morph into the heads of eagles, their beaks opening to reveal yet smaller forms nested within. This was the magical principle of zoomorphic transformation, where every part of an animal might itself become another animal, creating visual puzzles that delighted the eye while speaking to deeper truths about the interconnectedness of all living things. To trace these flowing lines with your finger was to follow the pathways of energy that connected earth to sky, predator to prey, the seen world to the realm of spirits. The colors they chose were drawn from the palette of their beloved steppes, the rich browns and golds of autumn grass, the deep reds of sunset clouds, the brilliant blues of the infinite sky. Their dyes came from the madder root that grew wild in the river valleys, from the precious lapis lazuli traded along the Silk Road, from the ochre that painted the cliffs where their ancestors were buried. Picture a Sarmatian woman preparing for her wedding day, seated before a bronze mirror as her sisters carefully apply the sacred tattoos that will mark her passage into the ranks of adult warriors. The designs they choose are not arbitrary decorations, but powerful symbols that will protect her in battle, identify her status within the clan, and carry the blessings of the ancestors into her new life. The tattooing process itself was a profound spiritual ceremony. The tools, sharp bronze needles, pots of pigment mixed with sacred herbs, were blessed by the shamans before use. The designs were traced first in charcoal, each line placed according to ancient traditions that connected the wearer to the cosmic order. As the needles pierced the skin, chants rose in the ancient tongue, calling upon the spirits to infuse the images with living power. The preserved body of a Sarmatian chieftain, found frozen in the Altai Mountains, reveals the stunning complexity of these tattoos. His shoulders bore massive deer with antlers that spiraled into infinity, their bodies covered with smaller creatures, in an endless dance of transformation. Along his arms, griffins pursued running elk, their wings spread wide as if to embrace the very sky. On his chest, a great cat prowled through stylized forests, its muscles rippling with captured motion. Each of these tattoos told a story, marked an achievement, recorded a vision received in dreams or trance. The dots that ran down his spine like a constellation, or perhaps a map of the shaman's journey through the spirit world, each point marking a station where sacred knowledge was received. The running animals spoke of hunts undertaken, both in the physical world and in the realm of the soul. But the language of symbols extended far beyond tattoos. Every object in Sarmatian and Scythian daily life was an opportunity for artistic expression. Their felt carpets, woven from the wool of sheep that grazed the high pastures, bloomed with images of mythical beasts and cosmic trees. Their leather clothing was decorated with bronze plaques that caught the light as they moved, turning every rider into a glittering constellation against the grassland backdrop. The women were particularly renowned for their skill in textile arts. Using looms that could be quickly assembled and disassembled as the tribe moved from pasture to pasture, they wove stories into cloth, tales of heroes and gods, of battles won and loves lost, of the eternal cycle of seasons that governed their nomadic lives. These textiles were not merely beautiful, but functional magic, their patterns designed to bring protection, fertility, and good fortune to those who wore them. The technique of felt making itself was almost alchemical in its transformation of raw wool into something entirely new. The women would lay out layers of fleece, sprinkle them with hot water and sacred herbs, Then roll the entire mass in leather and tie it behind a horse. As the animal galloped across the steppes, the motion would gradually compress and tangle the fibers until they formed a dense, waterproof fabric that could serve as anything from tent walls to winter coats. Into this felt they would work applique, designs of exquisite delicacy, silhouettes of reindeer racing across frozen lakes, eagles soaring through clouds of silk, mythical beasts that existed only in the realm of dreams. Each piece was unique, bearing the artistic signature of its creator, while following the ancient conventions that made the imagery readable to all who shared the steppe culture. The metalwork of these peoples reached heights of artistry that modern craftsmen still struggle to match. Working with bronze, silver, and gold, they created objects of such delicate beauty that archaeologists initially refused to believe they could have been produced by barbarian nomads. Belt buckles became miniature theaters where predators eternally pursued their prey. Horse bridles transformed the animals into mythical creatures, their heads crowned with bronze antlers, their harnesses gleaming with images of the hunt. The famous golden deer from the Kostromskaya kurgan embodies all the essential elements of the animal style. The creature's body is rendered with fluid grace, its legs folded beneath it in the stylized pose that art historians call the flying. Gallop. But look more closely, and you see that its antlers are not mere antlers. They have become a forest of smaller creatures, each one perfectly formed, creating a visual symphony that speaks of the endless creativity of the natural world. Their weapons, too, were canvases for artistic expression. Scythian arrows were not merely functional tools, but tiny works of art, their bronze points cast in forms that evoked the creatures they were meant to bring down. Sword hilts became the heads of eagles or snow leopards, their eyes inlaid with precious stones that seemed to glow with inner fire. The very act of drawing such a weapon was a prayer, a communion with the spirits that guided the hunter's hand. The language they spoke has largely vanished, leaving only scattered words preserved in the accounts of Greek and Roman observers. But we know it belonged to the great Indo-Iranian family of languages, related to the tongues spoken by the ancient peoples of India and Persia. In its sound patterns, we can perhaps hear echoes of the wind sighing through the grass, the rhythm of hoofbeats on hard earth, the musical jingling of harness bronze. What writing they possessed seems to have been primarily runic, simple marks carved into stone or wood, more often used for practical purposes than for literature or formal records. Theirs was an oral culture, where the great stories were carried in memory from generation to generation, preserved in the rhythms of epic poetry that could be recited around the campfire during the long winter nights. Yet their visual language was incredibly sophisticated, capable of expressing concepts that would require paragraphs of text to convey in written form. A single bronze plaque showing a griffin attacking a deer could communicate an entire cosmological system. The eternal struggle between sky and earth, the necessity of death in the cycle of life, the transformation that comes through conflict and surrender. The geometric patterns that bordered their designs were equally meaningful. Spirals spoke of the cyclical nature of time, the eternal return of seasons and generations. Interlocking curves suggested the bonds that held the community together, each individual life woven into the greater pattern. Angular patterns evoked the crystalline structure of ice and snow, the harsh beauty of the steppe winter that tested the strength of both man and beast. Their understanding of color symbolism was deeply sophisticated. Red was the color of life force, of blood and fire, and the dawn that brought each new day. Blue represented the infinite sky, the realm of the spirits, the cold purity of glacial ice. Yellow gold was the sun's power made manifest, the divine, light that illuminated both the physical and spiritual worlds. Black was not the color of death, but of the fertile earth from which all life springs, The rich humus of the river valleys where their herds grazed in spring. Even their most everyday objects carried this symbolic weight. A simple bronze mirror might be decorated with patterns that transformed it into a portal between worlds, its polished surface reflecting not just physical appearance, but spiritual truth. A ceramic vessel could become a miniature cosmos, its painted animals representing the forces that governed human destiny. As the various tribes gradually disappeared from history, absorbed by new peoples, or scattered by the great migrations that reshaped the Eurasian world, their artistic traditions did not simply vanish. Instead, they flowed like underground rivers into the cultures that followed, influencing the illuminated manuscripts of medieval Europe, the textile patterns of Central Asian peoples, the metalwork traditions of the northern forests. Today, when archaeologists carefully excavate the frozen tombs of Sarmatian nobles, they uncover not just objects, but an entire language of beauty that still speaks across the centuries. Each golden deer, each tattooed arm, each intricately woven textile is a page in a book written in symbols rather than words, a testament to the creative power of peoples who found the divine not in temples of stone, but in the flowing lines of artistic vision. As you drift toward sleep, dear listener, let your mind's eye trace those ancient patterns, the spiraling antlers that become forests of creatures, the griffins whose wings span eternity, the endless dance of hunter and hunted that plays out across the bronze surfaces of objects buried long ago beneath the steppe grasses. In your dreams, perhaps you will see them as their creators did, not as mere decoration, but as living symbols that bridge the gap between the earthly and the eternal, between the language of the tongue and the deeper language of the soul. The fire burns softly now, its light playing across imagined surfaces where bronze creatures seem to stir with phantom life. In that gentle glow, the ancient symbols live on, whispering their meanings to those who have eyes to see and hearts open to the beauty that transcends time itself. There is something deeply moving about the way civilizations pass from the world, not always with the crash of battle or the drama of conquest, but sometimes like the gradual changing of seasons, so subtle that only when we look back across the centuries do we realize that an entire way of life has transformed into memory. By the 2nd century of the Common Era, the great age of Scythian dominance on the steppes was already becoming a legend told around distant fires. New peoples were stirring in the depths of Asia, driven by pressures we can only imagine. Drought, perhaps, or the expansion of other tribes, or simply that restless energy that periodically sweeps across the grasslands like a great tide, reshaping the political landscape of half the world. The Goths were among the first to challenge the ancient order. Picture them as they appeared to the settled peoples of their time, tall warriors from the forests of the north, their long shields gleaming, with bronze bosses, their spears dark against the sky. But these were not the mindless barbarians of popular imagination. They were a people in motion, carrying with them their own rich traditions, their own understanding of honor and warfare, their own dreams of the lands they might claim, and kingdoms they might build. The Scytho-Sarmatian dominance of the Pontic steppe finally ended with the invasion of the Goths and other Germanic tribes around 200 AD, when the Scythian settlements in Crimea and the lower Borysthenes were permanently destroyed. But this was not a simple tale of conquest and defeat. It was something more complex, more human, a gradual process of encounter, conflict, negotiation, and ultimately transformation. When the Gothic warriors first encountered Sarmatian cavalry on the vast steppes, they met their equals in courage, if not in mounted warfare. The Sarmatians had generations of experience in the subtle arts of steppe combat, the feigned retreat that drew enemies into ambush, the coordinated charges that struck like lightning and vanished like smoke. But the Goths brought their own advantages, superior numbers perhaps, different tactical approaches, and most importantly, a hunger for new lands that matched the Sarmatians' ancient pride not the battles that decided the fate of the steppes were. Not recorded by historians, for these were proliterate peoples whose greatest deeds lived only in memory and song. But we can imagine them, desperate encounters in the dawn mist, with the thunder of hoofbeats and the ring of steel on steel echoing across the grasslands that had known such sounds for countless generations. Yet for every battle lost, there were also marriages made, alliances forged, cultures blended. Some Sarmatians chose to ride with the Gothic hosts, their cavalry skills too valuable to waste. Others retreated deeper into the steppes, joining with related tribes or founding new confederations that might preserve something of the old ways. In a changing world, some Sarmatians were absorbed by the Alans and Goths, while others assimilated with Proto-Circassian peoples and may have influenced the Circassian language. This was the pattern of the Great Migrations, not simple conquest, but a complex process of cultural mixing that created new identities from the mingling of old traditions. The arrival of the Huns in the 4th century brought an even more dramatic transformation. These were riders from the deep heart of Asia, masters of a style of mounted archery that made even the Sarmatians seem pedestrian by comparison. Their composite bows could send arrows through armor at distances that seemed impossible, and their horses were trained to wheel and charge with a precision that turned entire battlefields into deadly demonstrations of nomadic superiority. Scythians continued to exist until the invasion of the Huns in the 4th century AD, finally ceasing to exist as an independent group after being fully assimilated by other populations during the migration period in the 5th century AD. But again, this was not simple extinction. It was transformation, like water flowing into new channels, carrying with it the dissolved essence of what had come before. Under Hunnic leadership, many Sarmatian and Scythian warriors found new purpose. They rode in the great raids that shook the Roman Empire to its foundations, their lances gleaming alongside Hunnic arrows as they swept across Europe in campaigns that would be remembered for centuries. Attila himself, the great Hun king, relied heavily on auxiliary cavalry drawn from the peoples his nation had absorbed, riders whose grandfathers had served, Sarmatian chiefs now following the standards of the Scourge of God. When the Hunnic Empire collapsed in the late 5th century, it left behind a patchwork of successor states and wandering tribes, each carrying fragments of the great nomadic traditions that had once dominated the steppes. Some of these fragments would coalesce into new powers, the Bulgars, the Magyars, the various Turkish peoples who would later establish their own empires. Others would fade into the growing Slavic populations that were beginning to settle the lands once claimed by mounted nomads. During the early Middle Ages, the Proto-Slavic population of Eastern Europe assimilated and absorbed Sarmatians during their political expansion. This process was perhaps the most significant in terms of cultural preservation, for the Slavs were not destroyers but adapters, incorporating useful elements from the peoples they encountered while maintaining their own distinctive character. Picture a Slavic village being established in what had once been Sarmatian grazing lands. The settlers bring their own traditions of agriculture and handicraft, but they also inherit knowledge from the previous inhabitants, where to find the best pastures, how to read the weather signs that sweep across the open country, which herbs can heal and which can harm. Former Sarmatian warriors might serve as scouts and cavalry in Slavic armies, their children growing up bilingual, equally at home with Slavic folk songs and the ancient riding chants of the steppes. The archaeological record tells us that this blending was not always peaceful, but it was thorough. Sarmatian burial practices influenced Slavic funeral customs. Sarmatian metalworking techniques enhanced Slavic craftsmanship. Most importantly, Sarmatian military traditions helped shape the cavalry forces that would become so important in medieval Eastern European warfare. Sarmatism greatly affected the culture, lifestyle, and ideology of the Polish nobility, creating a unique cultural mix of Oriental, Western, and native traditions. This influence would persist well into the early modern period, when Polish nobles would proudly claim descent from Sarmatian warriors, decorating their palaces with artwork that evoked the ancient steppes and adopting customs that supposedly recalled the days when their ancestors rode free beneath the endless sky. But what happened to the people themselves? The individuals who had once called themselves Scythians or Sarmatians? Many simply disappeared into the growing populations around them, their distinctive identity diluted by intermarriage and cultural assimilation, until it existed only in the shape of a cheekbone, the arch of an eyebrow, or the half-remembered fragment of an ancient song. Others maintained their nomadic lifestyle by adapting to new circumstances. Some became the ancestors of the Alans, who would later establish kingdoms in Spain and North Africa before being absorbed by the peoples they ruled. Others joined the waves of migration that carried steppe peoples into the heart of Europe. Their descendants perhaps fighting at the Battle of Tours or serving in the palace guards of Charlemagne. The genetic legacy of these ancient peoples is still being unraveled by modern science. Archaeological and genetic collaboration presents the Sarmatians as a dynamic society connected across vast geographical areas through networks of trade, warfare, diplomacy, and migration. DNA studies of modern populations across Eastern Europe and Central Asia reveal traces of the great nomadic movements, genetic signatures that tell stories of love and war, conquest and cooperation. Across the centuries of the great migrations, perhaps most poignantly, fragments of their languages survived in the tongues of their successors. Scythian, spoken today in the Caucasus Mountains, preserves elements that may date back to Scythian and Sarmatian speech. Certain words in Slavic languages, particularly those related to warfare and horsemanship, may carry echoes of the ancient steppe vocabularies. Even the names of rivers and mountains across Eastern Europe sometimes whisper of older tongues, ghosts of languages that once rang across the grasslands. The horse cultures themselves, while transformed, did not entirely disappear. The techniques of mounted warfare, developed by the Scythians and Sarmatians, lived on in the military traditions of their successors. The heavy cavalry that dominated medieval battlefields, the light horse archers of the steppes who would later serve the Mongol Khans, even the cavalry charges that decided the fate of European kingdoms, all carried within them elements that could be traced back to the riding peoples of antiquity. Their artistic traditions, too, found new expressions in the cultures that absorbed them. The animal style that had flourished on Scythian metalwork influenced the decorative arts of migration period Europe. Viking jewelry, Germanic fibulae, Slavic ornaments, all sometimes bore the flowing lines and stylized creatures that recalled the ancient steppe aesthetic. The great manuscript illuminations of medieval monasteries occasionally revealed, in their intricate interlacing patterns, echoes of the designs that had once adorned Sarmatian horse gear. In the realm of spirit and belief, the influence was perhaps most subtle, but also most enduring. The shamanic traditions of the steppes, with their emphasis on ecstatic journeys and communication with animal spirits, blended with local folk practices to create new forms of spiritual expression. The reverence for horses, the understanding of the sacred relationship between rider and mount, continued in the horse blessing ceremonies that persisted in Eastern European Christianity well into the modern era. Even their understanding of honor and warfare left its mark. The idea that a warrior's worth was measured not by birth, but by deeds. That loyalty was a sacred bond transcending death itself. That courage in battle was the highest virtue a human could display. These concepts, refined in the crucible of steppe warfare, became part of the medieval European concept of chivalry and knighthood. As we look back across the centuries that separate us from these vanished peoples, we can see their influence spreading like ripples across the pond of history. A weapon technique here, a decorative motif there, a fragment of genetic heritage, a half-remembered story that somehow survived the collapse of the culture that created it. All testament to the truth that no people ever truly disappears, but rather transforms, like energy changing from one form to another, impossible to destroy, but constantly becoming something new. The great kurgan burial mounds that dot the steppes from Ukraine to Kazakhstan stand as monuments to their memory. Artificial hills that have watched the rise and fall of empires, the coming of agriculture and industry, the transformation of the grasslands they once guarded. Archaeologists still excavate these ancient tombs, finding golden artifacts and preserved textiles, tattooed bodies, and sacrificed horses. The material remains of lives lived with passion and purpose under the vast sky, but perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Scythians and Sarmatians lies not in objects that can be displayed in museums, but in the concept they embodied, the idea that humans could live free, that identity need not be tied to place, that courage and honor were more valuable than comfort and security. In every tale of knights errant, in every story of heroic wanderers, in every dream of escape from the constraints of settled life, something of their spirit lives on. As the last embers of our fire settle into ash, dear listener, let your mind drift to those final days when the ancient riders still moved across the steppes, when the old songs were still sung around dying fires, when the wind still carried the voices of a people who had known true freedom. In your dreams, perhaps you will glimpse them, shadows at the edge of vision, riders disappearing into the morning mist, their horses' hoofbeats fading into the eternal rhythm of wind through grass. They are gone now, these children of the steppes, dissolved into the great river of human history like salt into water. But the river itself is changed by their presence, carrying something of their essence into all the cultures it touches, all the stories it nurtures, all the dreams it inspires. In the end, perhaps this is immortality, not to be remembered perfectly, but to become part of everything that follows, invisible but essential, like the minerals in spring water that give it its distinctive taste. The wind still blows across the grasslands, carrying with it the whispers of ancient voices, the echo of vanished laughter, the ghost of songs that once rang beneath a sky that knows no boundaries, no end, no final sunset, that would mark the close of all the stories ever told beneath its infinite embrace. Stand with me, if you will, on a hill somewhere in the vast expanse between the Carpathians and the Urals, where the morning mist is just beginning to lift from the grasslands. Here, scattered across the landscape, like the remnants of some titanic chess game, rise the ancient kurgan burial mounds, artificial hills that have watched over this land for more than 2,000 years. Silent sentinels keeping vigil over the memories of the vanished horsemen. These great burial mounds, some over 20 meters high, dot the Ukrainian and Russian steppe belts and extend in great chains for many kilometers along ridges and watersheds. Each one represents not just a grave, but a promise kept across the millennia, that the great chiefs and warriors of the steppes would not be forgotten, that their deeds would be remembered as long as grass grows and wind blows across the Chul. Endless prairie. Picture the scene as one of these mighty tombs was first excavated by modern archaeologists. The anticipation in the air as the first shovelfuls of earth are removed, the growing excitement as the outline of a burial chamber begins to emerge. Then the moment of breathless wonder as the flashlight beam reveals what has lain hidden in darkness since the days when Rome was still building its empire. Golden vessels that gleam like captured sunlight, bronze horse gear that seems to pulse with remembered life, the preserved remains of warriors whose faces still bear the marks of their sacred tattoos. The Tovsta Mohila kurgan, belonging to the 4th century BC and excavated in 1971, contained the famous golden pectoral that is now exhibited in the Museum of Historical Treasures of Ukraine. This single artifact, a golden chest ornament of extraordinary beauty, tells an entire story in its flowing lines and intricate imagery. Here are the animals of the steppes, caught in eternal chase, the mythical griffins with wings spread wide, the delicate scrollwork that seems to breathe, with its own inner life. But the pectoral is more than mere ornament. It is a map of the Scythian cosmos, a visual prayer that was meant to protect its wearer in both this life and the next. Every curve of its golden surface speaks of beliefs and understandings that we are only beginning to decipher, messages from a vanished world that somehow still pulse with meaning across the centuries. As we wander through the museums where these treasures now rest behind climate-controlled glass, we can almost feel the presence of their original owners. Here is a silver vessel decorated with scenes of daily life, warriors milking mares, shamans conducting rituals, hunters pursuing the sacred deer whose antlers branch into infinity. There, a bronze mirror whose polished surface once reflected faces we will never see, eyes that looked out upon a world we can only imagine. The small burials around the kurgans demonstrate beyond all doubt that these were sacred places that attracted people for burial purposes also in later archaeological periods. About 500 Sarmatian burial mounds remain in the Attara region alone. This tells us something profound about the lasting power of these ancient sites, that centuries after the last Scythian chief was laid to rest, people still felt the pull of these sacred hills, still chose to bury their own dead in the shadow of the great riders' tombs. Think of what this means, dear listener. Long after the languages of the steppes had been forgotten, long after the tribal names had passed into legend, something in the human heart still recognized the holiness of these places. Farmers would find their children drawn to play among the ancient mounds. Travelers would pause to rest their horses in the shelter of hills that their ancestors had raised to honor the heroic dead. Even today, local people speak of the kurgans with a mixture of reverence and unease, as if something of the old magic still lingers in their earthen depths. But the physical remains, precious as they are, tell only part of the story. The deeper legacy of the Scythians and Sarmatians flows like an underground river through the cultures that followed them, surfacing in unexpected places, coloring traditions whose origins have been long forgotten. The Sarmatians' adoption of scale armor for horse and rider was a tactic that would later influence medieval European knights. When we see a medieval manuscript illumination of a knight in shining mail, when we read of the great cavalry charges that decided the fate of kingdoms, we are witnessing the distant echo of innovations first perfected on the steppes by riders whose names history has forgotten. The very concept of knighthood, the idea that a warrior's worth is measured by his deeds rather than his birth, that loyalty is a sacred bond transcending death itself. These ideals were refined in the crucible of steppe warfare centuries, before they found their way into the European imagination. Every tale of knight-errantry, every story of a hero riding forth to right wrongs and protect the innocent, carries within it something of the spirit that once animated the great riders of the grasslands. But perhaps the most profound legacy of these vanished peoples lies not in their military innovations or artistic achievements, but in their understanding of what it means to be truly free. The Scythian Sarmatians were nomadic pastoralists who bred cattle, sheep, goats, and horses, but they were something more than mere herders. They were the embodiment of a different way of being human, one that recognized no authority save that of the sky above and the earth beneath, no boundaries save those imposed by the changing seasons and the needs of their beloved animals. In our modern world of cities and smartphones, of scheduled appointments and mortgage payments, there is something both alien and deeply appealing about their way of life. They carried their homes with them, following the ancient rhythms of migration that connected them to the cosmic order. Their wealth was not stored in banks, but measured in the strength of their horses, the loyalty of their followers, the wisdom of their shamans. According to Herodotus, The favorite victims at sacrifices were horses, and it is especially in the funeral rites that the religious significance of the horse becomes clear. This reverence for the horse was not mere practical appreciation, but recognition of a spiritual partnership that elevated both human and animal to something greater than either could achieve alone. The horse was not property, but companion, not tool, but sacred ally in the great adventure of existence. This understanding persists in pockets of the modern world. In the horse cultures of Central Asia, in the traditions of cowboys and gauchos, in the riding schools where humans still learn to move in harmony with their four-legged partners, something of the ancient wisdom lives on. When a rider achieves that moment of perfect unity with his mount, when human and horse move as one being, they are touching something that the Scythians knew intimately, the transcendence that comes from partnership rather than domination. The genetic legacy of the steppe peoples continues to unfold as DNA analysis becomes more sophisticated. In the blood of modern populations across Eastern Europe, Central Asia, and even Western Europe, scientists are finding the molecular signatures of ancient migrations, the genetic echoes of love stories and conquests that played out across the grasslands centuries ago. Each of us may carry within ourselves a heritage of riders whose names were never written down, whose individual stories are lost forever, but whose essence flows on in the great river of human inheritance. Their languages, too, have left there, marked in ways we are only beginning to understand. In the Ossetian tongue still spoken in the Caucasus Mountains, linguists hear echoes of the ancient Scythian speech. In the horse-related vocabulary of Slavic languages, in the military terms that passed from culture to culture along the ancient trade routes, fragments of their words live on, disguised but not destroyed by the passage of centuries. Even there, spiritual traditions continue to influence us in subtle ways. The shamanic practices that allowed them to journey between worlds, to communicate with the spirits of animals and ancestors, have found new expression in modern healing traditions and environmental movements. The understanding that all life is interconnected, that humans are not masters, but participants in the great web of existence, speaks to contemporary concerns about our relationship with the natural world. Their artistic traditions, transformed and adapted, continue to inspire. The flowing lines of the animal style, with its endless transformations and mystical creatures, can be seen echoing through decorative arts from Ireland to Iran. Modern tattoo artists, often unknowingly, recreate patterns that first adorned the bodies of Sarmatian warriors. Jewelry designers draw inspiration from the golden treasures of the kurgans, translating ancient symbols into contemporary forms. But perhaps most importantly, the Scythians and Sarmatians left us something less tangible but more enduring than any artifact or genetic signature. They left us the memory of a different way of being human. In every person who feels the call, of the open road, who dreams of escape from the constraints of settled life, who finds peace in the company of animals and the silence of wild places, something of their spirit lives on. They remind us that civilization need not mean confinement, that sophistication can coexist with freedom, that the highest forms of art and spirituality can emerge from peoples who never built a permanent city. They challenge our assumptions about progress and development, suggesting that there are forms of wealth that cannot be measured in dollars, kinds of success that have nothing to do with accumulation of possessions. As the last light fades from our fire and the night settles around us like a comfortable blanket, we can feel their presence in the wind that stirs the grass, in the distant howl of wolves that still roam the wild places, in the eternal dance of stars across the dome of night. They are gone, these children of the steppes, but they are not lost. They have become part of the wind itself, part of the endless conversation between earth and sky that plays out across the grasslands they once called home. In your dreams tonight, dear listener, you may find yourself riding across endless prairies under a sky so vast it seems to swallow the horizon. The horse beneath you moves with the fluid grace of water, its hoofbeats keeping time with your heartbeat. In the distance, you glimpse the smoke of cooking fires, hear the laughter of children playing among the horses, catch the sound of ancient songs carried on the evening breeze. This is their final gift to us, the understanding that some things transcend the boundaries of time and culture, that the human spirit, like the wind itself, cannot be contained or conquered. In every sunrise that paints the eastern sky, in every storm that sweeps across the open country, in every moment when we feel ourselves part of something larger than our individual lives, we touch the eternal mystery that the Scythians and Sarmatians knew so well. They lived as children of the wind, and when their time on earth was done, they returned to the wind, becoming part of its endless journey across the face of the world. Listen closely, and you can still hear them, in the whisper of grass beneath the infinite sky, in the distant thunder of phantom hoofbeats, in the ancient songs that the wind still remembers, and sometimes, on nights like this, condescends to sing to those who have learned to listen with their hearts. The fire dies to ash, but the stars burn on, eternal witnesses to the continuing story of human dreams and aspirations. And somewhere in the vast spaces between the stars, the great riders continue their journey, following paths invisible to mortal eyes, forever free, forever young, forever part of the endless dance between earth and sky that we call life itself. Sleep now, dear listener, and let your dreams carry you to those distant steppes where the wind still whispers the names of heroes, where the grass still grows green above the graves of kings, where the ancient songs echo still in the spaces between silence and sound, between memory and dream, between what was and what might yet be in the infinite possibilities that stretch before us like an endless prairie beneath the dome of night.